So what we're looking at now is basically a British history of racism and classism. Okay, that's like the short title, but the longer title, you could say we're seeing how has British culture responded to the revelation of human beings being made in the image of God. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but it obviously fits in with what we looked at last time. You know, we saw how in the Bible, the first thing it says about humans is that they're made in the image of God. We looked at some of the, what I called categories of being made in the image of God, some of the ways that we're like God. You know, we saw things like we got a voice, we can have relationships, we're able to assess things, to evaluate things. We have power where we can influence the world, and we represent God. And I said how those categories, you'll find them in Genesis chapter 1 to 3. We looked at how in Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make mankind in our image so that they may rule. So we saw that being made in the image of God was so that image bearers could rule. And it was the idea that all image bearers would rule, not that there's a select group that rule and the rest don't, or that there's a select group that rule over a lesser group. The idea is that all of humanity is supposed to be ruling for God and spreading God's loving rule. And we also, if you remember, we looked at the so-called curse of Ham. We looked at that. And so with all that information, we're now basically looking at, well, what's the history in Britain? How have people responded to this truth? And we're doing this in light of Romans 1:18 to 19, where it talks about humans suppressing the truth, right? Pushing the truth down. And what we're getting at is that God revealed in his word that all of humanity was made in his image. In Britain, how have we responded to that revelation? How have we at times suppressed that truth, tried to push it down, hide it away, ignore it? Or to what extent have we said, yes, all of mankind is made in God's image? And as we go through the history, we see that we've done a bit of both in Britain. What we're also going to see, and well, first, let me just say, we would expect to see some suppression of the truth as well, because if human beings are made in the image of God, made in God's likeness, so that when you see a human being, you see something of God. If humanity has been suppressing the truth about God ever since the fall, it would make sense that humans would particularly suppress the truth about who humans are. That there'd be something within us that would want us to actually suppress the truth that human beings are made in the image of God. Because ultimately, impacted by sin, we suppress the truth of who God is. So we're going to suppress the truth of who his image bearers are, made in his likeness. Okay, now, second thing, as we go through this history, what we're going to see, and we'd expect to see this based off the last session, right, is that as people respond to the revelation that humans are made in God's image, people have either used their power to serve and protect people, or they've used their power to exploit and demean people. People have used their powers of assessment to either suppress people, to dominate people, or to serve alongside people. And people have used their relationships, another aspect of being made in the image of God. People have used their relationships as a way to either suppress people or to serve and protect people. And people have even used their forms of enjoyment to do that. So we looked at how enjoyment is part of being made in the image of God. And we see how all these things come together in history. And I just want to, before we jump into the history, I just want to read out a quote from Bavinck. You can see it there in your handout. He says, when humanity fell, it lost nothing substantial, no faculty even, and no power. What happened was that since sin violated the form of the entire human nature, These faculties and powers now function so as to produce no longer the knowledge and righteousness of God, but their very opposites. I'll let you read the rest of the quote later, but look at the end of the quote. He says that, humans kept all their human components, capabilities and powers, the form, the character and nature, the set and direction of all these capacities and powers were so changed that now, instead of fulfilling the will of God, they fulfill the law of the flesh. So in other words, at the fall, people didn't stop being the image of God. We saw that last time as well. People didn't stop having the power of assessment. They didn't stop having the authority to use their power to serve and protect. They didn't stop having power. They didn't stop having the ability to have relationships. They didn't stop having the ability to have enjoyment. But whereas before the fall, all those things were directed towards spreading God's loving rule, after the fall, they were spread towards the flesh. They were spread to doing whatever is selfish. And I find this really helpful because as we look at the history, there's different ways you can interpret the history. Some people would say, do you know what? All that happened was that the science was wrong and people started thinking wrong things about race. And as a result of that, there was slavery. As if it's kind of just an accident, that a little mistake that people ended up doing transatlantic slavery, or a mistake of all the classism that has gone on in Britain over the years. Another way of reading history is to say, actually, all of this stuff that happened was going the direction of the flesh. This is the way that the flesh will take you. This is the way that indwelling sin will take you. This is the way that the devil will want to take you. And I think that is probably a more biblical assessment of what happens with the history.